sharing some perspectives on the question, what makes a movement practice? In this question lies, of course, a slight provocation. A provocation in the sense of, if I'm aspiring, or if I believe, or I am creating an effort towards developing this movement practice, am I on the right path? Am I leading in the right direction? Is my physical practice and everything that goes beyond that contributing towards this objective of a movement practice? One of the things that we, of course, have to outline in the initial instance is, what is this idea of movement that we are practicing? This has been many years in the making, because whenever you come to a fixed conclusion with regards to what is movement, and from that, what is a movement practice, it comes with an innate danger, because it's a paradox. When you set down ideas with regards to movement, these ideas become static, and this is in direct antithesis towards movement. So everything that I mention from here onward should be taken not with a pinch, but with a basket full of salt, in the understanding that these perspectives will change and develop over time. However, I feel that at this point in time, there are some fundamental core threads and a backbone to this personal. I try to avoid using the term philosophy because it's very, very loaded with different traditions and perspectives and things like this. So let's just use this perspective on what is movement. I've said this many times in different places, but for me, zooming out as far as possible, I say that movement is the underlying condition of everything we experience and everything beyond that which we cannot directly experience. Movement, of course, has a physical aspect. The pixels on your screen right now are in continuous movement. When you turn off the screen itself is in continuous vibration with regards to the atoms in your screen. Your body, whether you're sitting still or moving in or through space, is in continual vibration, not just within itself, but with everything beyond it too. As a condition, it does not follow that it's conditional. So what does this mean? The condition is a constant. It is always there. It's a given. It's not conditional in that sometimes it's moving, sometimes it's not. The question might arise from this that, okay, if there's movement, then what about stillness? Stillness, for me, is an effective impossibility. There can be no such thing as stillness. This is not to detract from practices of stillness practices, efforts which try to slow oneself down, so to speak, so that we can observe the movement happening around us, to gather information and understanding from this, to draw conclusions from this. It's simply to say that there's a gradation from a lot of movement to not so much movement, but always movement. Even in the end days, when the pulse stops and the brain frequencies cease, movement continues in the decomposition of the body, in the changing memories and reflections of loved ones who knew you. And in some sense, you continue to exist, you continue to move. As you're dispersed and re-given back to the earth and the universe from which you came, you continue to be part of that universal movement. Movement is the underlying condition of everything. So, this is our departure point. Then what is a practice of this? Well, we have to understand, first of all, that the movement practice I'm referring to is one which is explored through the modality, the inescapable modality of your being. And a being has many layers. So if we were to outline some fundamental layers of being, we have a physical layer, we of course have a psychological layer, we have a spiritual layer, a social layer, and certain lists can go on with regards to what layers that we have as a being. Now, the physical layer is the layer through which we practice, and through this practice try to understand a little bit better about the subject that we're dealing with, this incredibly macro subject, if not the widest macro subject there is, which is movement. The physical layer is very convenient because it's the most immediate layer that we have. We have immediate sensual feedback, whether speaking with regards to our physical senses. We can hear, we can touch, we can smell, we can sense differences in pressure, we can sense differences in intensity, we can sense differences in temperature and volume. But beyond this, of course, we have sensual capacities as well. However, working through the physical layer, it's the most immediate feedback we have. It's not to say it's the most accurate feedback we have, because when we receive a sensory impulse, let's say, for example, let's be really practical about it, I lift a heavy weight. For some people, they have the same sensory feedback, but they interpret this as a type of discomfort, something negative, something that does not pleasure them, something bad. You can take another individual and place them in this context, and they feel a sense of liberation, euphoria, and freedom. So, I'm certainly not the first to propose that our sensory interpretations can be misleading to perhaps outright false. However, it's the most immediate feedback that we have, and so this is the layer on which we choose to practice. We can then from this point go into other practices, internal practices, reflective practices, spiritual practices, and wider, attending to all those different layers. However, the most immediate that we work with is the physical layer. This is when we come to movement practice. Movement practice then informs our understanding of what movement is, our perspective of what we think movement is just that. It constitutes our perspective, our informed perspective, our perspective gathered through experience, our point of view, which is always in change if we are embracing movement, if we are working with movement, if we are allowing ourselves to change and adapt to the different stimuluses and the different things we learn over time. So the practice informs our perspective, and then our perspective ultimately informs in return how we practice. And we have this ongoing cycle. This ongoing cycle is then characteristic of growth, of growing. And now growth cannot be confused with progression. Progression is a measure. Progression, when we place a measure on something, it becomes innately biased in a sense that a measure has something less or something more, and it equates with something worse or something better. Growth is different. When you look at a tree, when I watch my little bonsai as he grows without discrimination. He doesn't necessarily grow thinking, I'm getting better, I'm progressing. This doesn't come into the mindset of Victor Bonsai when he's growing. Victor Bonsai is simply growing. Now, as humans, with many further psychological layers than Victor Bonsai, we then have the possibility for reflection and to determine if how we are growing, how we are developing, is contributing towards certain objectives that we have. This is, of course, a measure, because at some point, if we want to be directed in our growth, we do have to start to outline what are my objectives in my various fields of practice. So on the zoomed out layer with movement practice, and again, far from the first one to say this, for me the objective is becoming a better human being. To understand what it means to become a better human being and how to become a better human being is precisely part of that practice as well. For me, this is the wider umbrella of a movement practice. And what we should initially see right there in this moment is that to do this effort, it doesn't actually require physical practice whatsoever. It doesn't require it. If you no longer had a physical practice, would you still be a movement practitioner? So something very, very provocative to consider if you're deeply invested in your physical practice, and especially towards the efforts of developing, understanding, cultivating, and growing in response to your individual movement practice. Stepping deeper into the realm of physical practice, when we start to work with locating, mapping, and investigating, exploring, diving into aspects of movement as a physical practice, this is something we continually need to keep in mind, and this is how we can start to understand and answer the question, what constitutes a movement practice? And am I following in this direction of what I believe a movement practice is, can, and should be? So the difficulty lies, and this is not just on the physical layer, the difficulty lies in that between our experience, the interpretation of our experience, and movement as it is, there are many, many layers which can often constitute blockages. When I watch a sunset, and I see the movement of the sun descending down as the colors change in the sky and the temperature decreases and everything begins to quieten just a little. Am I experiencing this as movement happening? Or am I thinking, what a beautiful sunset? There is a Zen story, I don't recall exactly where it's from, but it's a Zen master who invites a student to watch the sunset with him. Master is watching the sunset in silence. The student feels very uncomfortable. It's just kind of quiet. I have to say something. Master, don't you think this is one of the most beautiful sunsets you've ever seen? The master turns around and he beats him over the head. Because he did not see the sunset. All he saw was beauty. And beauty is not the sunset. Beauty is a layer in between. And if you can start to understand this, then we can start to understand how actually difficult and profound it is when we try to approach studying a subject such as movement, which ultimately is something so pure, so simple, so readily available to us everywhere, that we almost can't experience it without having these layers between it. And yet we try. We must try if we want to develop a movement practice. So a more practical example, am I practicing movement? Or am I practicing capacity and skill development? I'm trying to learn a muscle up. I'm trying to learn a handstand. I'm trying to learn a locomotion flow. Am I trying to learn about movement? Or am I investing in the thing before, maybe even many, many layers before the thing? This is not supposed to be a lesson in, oh, you're doing it wrong. Go back to the drawing board. No, John, you thought you were doing a movement practice, John, but it's not a movement practice. You're still stuck back there, lower on the rung. I'm in this journey with you. I'm in the journey with you. We're all growing. We're all trying to learn. But as soon as it becomes not about that growth, as soon as it becomes not about that learning and it becomes about something else, it's no longer about movement. It's no longer a movement practice. And I don't care how well you seem to move, or how many skills you have, or how aesthetic it looks, or how much knowledge you've read and gathered and developed about this subject. I don't care how many people you can quote. What does it truly come down to? And this, my friends, is the individual responsibility of the practitioner entirely. We must create these containers, however. We must create these containers through which we can learn more, understand, start to simply experience being in and of movement. We must have these containers, these structures, these directions, these contexts, these frames, these scores, whatever you want to call it. We must have them to create that experience. But it's not about those containers. We must be ready at any point to throw that container to the side, to completely leave it, abandon it, right in the middle, throw it away, without a look back, without a second thought. This is the practice as well. Can I throw all of that shit away and still be engaged deeply, passionately, entirely with my movement practice? One where we can start to determine if my physical practice is heading in this direction, if it's being informed by a movement perspective. One way we can ensure that it's always heading in that direction is precisely to take these moments of stepping back, of reflecting, of asking questions, not just of what we're doing, but of who and what we are, our beliefs, what we think is right and wrong, why we are resistant to certain things, why we are very accepting of others. At the same time, we have to understand that movement as an experience is not the same for every person. Of course, we have collective experience, but when it comes down to the individual, no one experience is the same as the other. Through these differences in experience and how we interpret them is essentially from what develops, maybe we can call it our individuality, our ego. And in order to function as a civilized human being, in any case, this ego is something that we must have. It's not something we necessarily must invest in and have as something concrete and unmovable. However, there are aspects of our individuality that we must maintain and understand and respect as we are digging deeper into this subject. Still questioning them, but over time we should find core aspects of ourselves which remain constant. Our personal values, our personal and collective morals, our objectives and our goals in life and for ourselves and for others around us. And through this lens, through these directed objectives of who and what I believe I'm about, which again is always changing or should always be changing and developing over time, but at the same time, like panning for gold, as I start to sift through the sand, I start to notice there are particular chunks that are more valuable than others. Certain things start to slip away, which I thought were really, really important. And slowly over time, I start to see threads that are fundamentally me, that I believe are valuable, that I believe are supporting me on my journey in developing and taking me further on this path of growth. So we still have to respect these individual things, and in many cases they turn into individual orientations. Of course, some people will prefer some type of physical practice to another. They will be more oriented towards one teacher than another, one method, one style, certain disciplines when we're diving into these places than others. And of course, this directly informs our experiences. Our movement experiences ultimately becomes our movement thumbprint, and our thumbprint is always different to the person next to us. John, let me see your thumbprint. Sorry, John, that's the wrong one. You didn't get it. Look, John, this is the one. That's the thumbprint there. Look, you see that? That's the correct movement thumbprint. We can't say this. We can't say this. So we do respect that as our movement practice, our physical practice develops, it will begin to be different. Not only to the person around us and the other practitioners, but also to how our practice was 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even yesterday. If I'm embracing movement, I'm able to adapt, I'm able to grow and move forward. And take this information with me in a collectively compounding, productive manner. It becomes my constitution, it becomes what I'm made of. But at the same time, we must still reflect and question. Is what I'm doing contributing to this overarching objective of understanding and growing through the process and learning what is movement? What is this subject? How does it affect me? How can I be affected by it in a way that I can grow productively? So when again it comes to the paper, programming, something like this, whatever you're studying, whatever you're taking yourself through, whatever you're enduring, whatever your journey, whatever your projects, are they directed towards, are they carried out with the intention of better informing my understanding of what is movement, and then again my movement perspective, and so that it may inform this practice in return. And this is why I've said previously as well, in different places, that you can have a movement practitioner balancing on one hand. You can have a hand balancer on the other hand, balancing on one hand. Doesn't matter if it's the left or the right hand. But the practice is entirely different. Entirely different. There's no better or worse here. We're not going to this place. But the hand balancer is balancing on their hand because they're practicing hand balancing. And that is the finality of it. It's my identity. This is what I do. I balance on the hands, very often, just one of them. How I believe a perspective of a movement practitioner would follow in this scenario is that I am using this context to enrich my understanding of the general subject, the condition of movement. It's not better, it's not worse. It's simply something different. So where does this leave us? It leaves us where we want to always be, in a position of consideration, in a position of consistent reflection, in a position of always asking questions without the intention of receiving an answer. This places us right in the middle of the paradox of movement practice. We are trying to practice a thing which is impossible to locate, which is impossible to pin down, which is impossible to say, this is what it is, and this is the practice. Because by its very nature, it is always fleeting, it is always temporary, it is always. It is always the consistent condition. And it's ungraspable. It's ungraspable. And yet we try. And this is the practice. The effort, the cultivation, the humility to be able to move forward and keep doing it without resorting to the easy option of giving ourselves something at the end, giving ourselves a concrete objective, giving ourselves a reward, giving ourselves an idea that I'll get there, because you won't. And why won't you get there? Because you're already there. We're always already in movement. We've already done it. We've already done it. We've already achieved it all. And yet, even just saying this means nothing. It means nothing. Because precisely all of these layers and layers and layers and layers and layers between movement as it is and how we experience it and how we interpret it. And this is just what has happened to us in acceding to language and transgressing beyond the silence of animals and into another realm. The realm of language, the realm of signs, of signification, we can only ever refer. So movement practice is ultimately futile. So if you look at your practice, your physical practice, your training, your movement training, if you believe that it's taking you towards an end point, towards a goal, if you're practicing with the intention of succeeding, of achieving, of completing, of getting something, anything, there is a discrepancy because it's no longer about movement. It's become about those other things. And I think this is important to say now more than ever, because when I started this idea of, came into contact with movement practice, movement culture, things like this, these ideas, there was very, very little information. There's very, very few inputs from different experienced teachers. Very few perspectives, which can be very dangerous, especially on a subject that's so general, so fundamental to everything. So it's very important that as this now changes, you can find movement gym in most cities, movement teachers, left, right and centre. The qualification is coming soon. Keep your eye open for it. MoveMore MP certified movement trainer. As we move towards this area, much will be lost in the process. Much will be lost in the process. It's maybe a bit much to say much will be lost because that assumes that the stuff was there in the initial instance, but much will go unexplored, undeveloped, uninvestigated in the process. So it's very important that at this time space we bring it back to the fundamental of what we are trying to do. What are you trying to do? If you cannot answer this, you're in the perfect place. If you have an answer to this, it's a big problem. I understand that these words are just that, things floating in the air. They're not designed to give you answers. This would be entirely presumptuous and unrealistic and false. I hope that it just stimulates something in you to reflect. And through that reflection, if it is deep reflection and sincere reflection with an open mind and open heart, it will gradually over time affect everything that you do and everything that you are. It most certainly has for me. Something incredibly enriching. And it's something which deserves a little bit deeper thought than simply the consideration as a physical practice, as certain skills and subjects, movement aspects. It's more than this. It's much, much, much more. So I leave this with you to consider, to chew on, and to spit out, to take what's useful, completely disregard what is useless to you, and add to it what you believe is uniquely yours. I wish everyone well-being, well-movement. Until next time.